Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here today. All right, so I like to imagine our organization is a lot like everyone else's organization. We have this hunger to innovate and be more efficient and just do more with the resources we have. And most of the time that comes through in the form of projects. And for us, a project typically means something with a start and an end that's going to make some sort of significant change and also involves a lot of IT time, right? So our backlog of projects, or because our project work looks something like this, right? We have, at any given year, we finish maybe 20 to 25 of those kinds of projects. We have probably 10 to 15 active at any point, and some of these projects last many years, so they can be pretty big. And then the backlog is another 50 or so projects just waiting to be prioritized, waiting to be started. So we are definitely hungry when it comes to this kind of thing. And it's a lot of work. Our IT, when you talk to them, they'll say, goodness, this is some good job security because I will never be short of project work to do. And so we do our best to keep those organized, to keep them prioritized so that we know we're doing the right work. And so every year we do this annual planning effort where our department managers come together and they try to go through that backlog and pull out the things that don't matter anymore and really focus in on what we should be doing. I'm just kidding. Every year we do an annual planning process that looks more like this. We take those 50 projects or so in the backlog, and then we add another 50 projects on top of it. Every department sees things that change in the industry, change regulation-wise, and there's just more work they want to do. All the old work they wanted is still work that they want, and so we drop this huge weight, doubling the size of our backlog every year, it seems like. We don't finish any more projects. We don't add any more projects to the ongoing, but we do change up their priorities and really try to get more fit in there somehow. But it's kind of difficult because there's just this huge amount of work. And so when IT looks at that, they start to struggle with, why should I even bother estimating how much time this project's going to take or how much it's going to cost to do it? Because it might be 2 years before we get to that project. And by that point, who knows what's changed? There's so much work to come in, so much innovation, so much opportunity that we have to really do our due diligence managing it, making sure the right things get done. So when we're doing that, it's this iceberg of work. So at the very top, we have a small number of projects of that huge backlog managed by our EPMO, right? These are projects that have project managers assigned, experienced project managers. They have business analysts on them. They're in our Workfront project management tool. They have regular status reports. There's transparency. There's defined benefits to those projects. There's an idea of to some extent, there's an idea of what they're going to cost. There's resource hour tracking on those. And that takes care of a very small chunk, the tip of the iceberg of our work. Then just below the surface, there's this other batch of projects that are managed by the sponsoring department. So if our agency area, they've got people who can fill the project management role. They're not trained project managers. They're not dedicated business analysts, but they fill the role and they can get some of those less critical projects managed. Might be critical to them, but maybe not consequential in the grand scheme of things. So they'll manage some of those projects, but those are still in our work management tool, but there may not be formal status reports all the time. Sometimes there are, sometimes there aren't. There's not a dedicated business analyst or project manager. There might be some benefits identified, but there's probably not. Sometimes I guess there's resource allocations on those. People might track their hours to it. It's a lot less formal than those managed by the EPMO. And then there's this huge other chunk that really is what gets in the way, right? All these unknown projects with no oversight. So like I said earlier, a lot of our projects have historically been things that involve a lot of IT time, but there are still countless things that take a little bit of IT time. And those things add up as we do work, right? Someone wants a change to a system. They just want a new feature or a bug request that gets sent in through a through some sort of help desk ticket that gets routed to a developer, and they start working on it. They find out it's harder than they thought it was, but they just power through, and the next thing you know, they spent 200 IT hours trying to resolve that feature that seemed like a small request. Or there'll be entire business units that get reorganized. Doesn't really involve much IT time. It's like, oh, I'll just be a ticket to go move all these people over from these Active Directory groups to these other groups, right? And reassign some application permissions and roles. It's all these little things that are not in our work management tool. There's no project managers associated, no business analysts, there's no budget or defined requirements. None of the things that project management brings to the table help us at all there, right? There's this huge sink of time, and we end up spending probably 80 to 90% of our time doing those little things. And that really takes away from our ability to do those high level things that will really fill the hunger and innovate and drive costs, improved costs. And this is no secret. This has been a thing for a long time. And so a few years ago, our executive vice president, who our EA group reports to, was looking at it and said, I really want you all to understand all of the work that's going on here. I don't want to just see the IT projects. I want to see every project that's going on. I want to have an idea of why are we doing these things? Are we doing the right work? And he really had three asks for our group. Right? He wanted us to identify every project, whether or not it involved IT time, whether or not it was a huge project or a small undertaking, anything that had a start date, an end date, made some sort of change, and wasn't in the normal day-to-day work of a department. We should think of that as a project. He wants to know everything that's going on. And then he wants us to illustrate the alignment of each. So why are we doing those things, right? There might be, some of them might have a business case that define it, but a good chunk that under the water part of the iceberg may not have that. So if we're doing it, we should understand why we're doing it. And then he wants us to take all of that and show the progress towards our strategic plans. So every year we have this corporate plan that comes out, and it says, this is the direction we're going to go for the company. These are our goals. These are our corporate objectives. And how are we progressing on those? How are the projects that we're doing aligned to that? Are we making progress? Are we moving in the right direction? And he said, EA group, go at it, figure it out. So we're a pretty small team. There's only 3 of us on the team. And so we got together, we started talking about it, and it wasn't really a different kind of thing that we had done in the past. Like our enterprise architecture group sits in the EPMO. And so that it's not too foreign for us to look at projects, but there was still a different ask in here, right? How do we show progress to our strategic plans? How are we going to show the alignment? Because there's so many ways you could look at it. And so we tackled it with the same approach we have for any kind of new analysis work, right? With the first and primary question we ask is, how do we model it, right? Because in our opinion, that's what differentiates us from analysts, is that we're architects, we're enterprise architects. Our job is to make blueprints that tell the story of how the company is changing over time. If we don't do the modeling, then in our opinion, we're not doing architecture, we're just doing analysis, which is fine. But in this case, we know this is going to be an ongoing effort. It wasn't going to be a one and done kind of thing. So we know we needed a model to support it. But a model alone isn't enough, right? We have to be able to populate that model with data. So any model that we can't put data into, that we can't regularly update, that we can't sustainably maintain, is not a useful model, right? An empty model does no analysis for anybody. It's not helpful. And then if we can get the data, we also need to make sure that the model is set up so that it can support telling some sort of visual story, right? Our ask was to illustrate the alignment, not just say that they're aligned. So how do we illustrate it? How do we make it manageable? Because like I said earlier on, we add 50 projects to our backlog every year. All of those are in scope of it. Plus there's hundreds of little things that are going on that are meaningful, but some of them are big, some of them are small. We're going to weed out for this, but we can't just give a giant 10-page document. It's not going to help. It needs to be visual. And so the model needs to be set up to do that. And we'll talk about some of the things we had to do to make sure that works. But in our opinion, these are the things that go into making a good model. It has to have a good structure. It has to be maintainable for the data that's in it. And it has to be able to come together to tell a story. And so we went and we talked about this and we kicked it around for probably a few weeks, testing out different things, different approaches, different types of components, connection types. And what we knew right away was on the strategy side, we were going to stick with the business motivation model. So we had been using this for a long time in different forms, right? So if you go into ABACUS, there's a sample project in there, and it has the picture you're looking at right here. This is the meta model for the business motivation model. It's the same group that publishes the BPMN standard publishes this. It is a standard for doing strategy, I suppose, if you will. And so the way this works out is there's two major components on the top. On the left is your means. So what are you going to do? And then the ends is where do you want to be in the future? And so when we fill this out, we usually start on the right side and say, what do you want the future to look like? What are your desired results, right? There are goals, objectives, and a vision, right? So the vision says, if we're successful in our mission, how will our organization, how will our customers, how will the industry look if we're successful in what we're trying to do? A goal is this thing you have to maintain for a long period of time in order to consider yourself successful. It's not do this project or be more financially strong, right? It's a goal has to be something that is sustainable and keeps moving the needle. And then objectives are those smart things, right? There's specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, time-bound. They're those milestones that help quantify whether or not you're achieving your goals, right? We try to set goals at a 3 to 5 year window, objectives at a 1 year window. So that describes where you want to be, and that's how the business model handles it. The business motivation model handles it. And on the left side, your means, this is your mission. It's what you're doing every day. It's what your purpose is. And then your courses of action. So your strategies, which are these more philosophical statements of direction. We should do this and not that. And we should be good at this area, but not that area. And we're going to be great over here, right? So you can't directly do a strategy. A strategy isn't, again, it's not a project. It's just, it is a direction that you can't directly do. And a tactic is the lever that you can pull. It might be considered a project. It could be increasing staff could be a tactic, or application portfolio management could be a tactic on its own, right? So it's the things that you're going to do that are going to channel effort towards the ends you want to reach. And that's the core part of the model that's relevant for what we're talking about. But there's the bottom part of it too, this assessment in the bottom right and influencers in the bottom left. Those are less about what we're trying to achieve, but they're a tool to help you think through what your goals and what your strategies should be. They tell you to look at your internal influences, your external influences, do some sort of SWOT analysis on those to understand what success looks like, make your goals based on that so that your strategies are reacting to some sort of influence, and that your goals and objectives are directed and influenced by or motivated by these SWOT analysis you do. So it's a great tool for talking about the strategy and where we want to be. It is not a great tool, as we discussed in all of our conversations, for illustrating it. Some of the things that work about this model is that a goal can be enabled by another goal, and an objective can quantify one or more goals. A strategy can channel effort towards one or many goals. A tactic can channel effort towards one or many objectives, and a tactic can implement one or many strategies. So you end up with this really complex many-to-many relationship in here that does not translate well to PowerPoint or Word or any kind of visual that we had tried in the past. It's just very complicated to see how that works out. You can repeat different components on the list, but it's not a good visual. So we knew we needed something else to tell the rest of it. So we decided the Balanced Scorecard. It is a well-known tool. There's plenty of information out there on how it works. So it's not like we're on our own here. We could easily pick up the Balanced Scorecard and do something with it. And this is an example we have to pull offline, but there's some familiar items on here, right? There's a vision and a mission that are similar, but it has a couple key components to it, right? So there's this idea of running of the rows across here: financial, customer, internal, process. those are perspectives, right? They ask you to look at success from different points of view. What does success mean financially? What does success mean from the point of view of your customer? What does success mean for your internal processes, or what does it mean from organizational capacity, right? And that map that they build there, they call a business objectives and strategy map. And then continuing across those perspectives, your financial side says these are the measures. So financially, we're going to look at net profit, operating costs, market revenue, and target markets. The targets say, well, net profit should increase 5% each year, and operating costs should decrease 3% each year. And so that makes sense. But then the initiatives on the side, those are the projects that you're doing, which is what started this whole situation we were in. And you just list up, these are the projects that are moving the financial needles. And the row below that, these are the projects that are moving the customer needles. And so we knew this was a good tool, and we wanted to make this part of our our core meta model. And so this is where it tried to fit in. Now, our meta model is based on the enterprise business motivation model, which is separate than the business motivation model from before. But it's this I guess super mixed kind of thing. It pulls in a lot of different models. So in the top center there, you kind of have the business model canvas and all the parts that make that up. You've got customer journey mapping pulled into it. You've got some TOGAF business architecture concepts, ITIL service framework. You'll get Michael Porter's 5 forces. If you're into strategy, that's a big part of it. It takes into account the PMI project management body knowledge. It uses the business motivation model, and it ties all of the models together. And so our meta model is this big mesh of all of it, right? And so we knew that the Balanced Scorecard was a great tool to display it, and so we need to make sure that our model supports it. And so we assumed that it kind of fit there in the business motivation model space and the project management space, somewhere in there. And so that's the piece we wanted to add. And so we went to go build the meta model that goes with the Balanced Scorecard so that it could all flow together, right? Because we didn't want separate things. We didn't want like perspectives and business objectives and strategy map and metrics and all of that to be isolated, right? We wanted that to be the same components we use everywhere else so that we can eventually tie an individual influence all the way down to an application that we're going to be changing, or a capability, or a piece of data, right? We want to be able to tie everything in this model together. And if we just put the business or the scorecard completely on its own, it would just be an island, and we didn't want that. We really wanted it to be fully integrated with our meta model. So we said, all right, how do we map the business motivation model to that scorecard? And this is what happened. It did not map. It did not match even a little bit. Well, with one exception. Vision and mission were a perfect match. The definition of how you see vision and mission described in different research and publications on Balanced Scorecard, it's a match. They mean the same thing. But then strategic priorities and strategic results, we didn't have anything on a model, and our model is pretty robust, but there's no concept of those in there. If you look at the business motivation model, maybe those are goals, maybe they're strategies, maybe they're just desired results, which is kind of the super type of goals and objectives. Maybe that's what they're getting at. It was pretty unclear. The entire concept of perspectives does not exist in the business motivation model. Business motivation model is dealing with influences and assessments, where the approach to figure out what strategies, goals, and objectives you should have in the scorecard is a completely different approach. And so we had to figure out what to do about perspectives. The thing in the middle is called the circles, all the lines. That's called the business objectives and strategy map. And I don't know, are those objectives? Are they strategies? It was very unclear. And whatever you read on it, it kind of went both ways. And so if you look, there's an example, ABACUS architecture for it. And when you pull up that, there are objectives in there. So we thought, well, maybe those could match to objectives. But as we started building out more of it, we realized that it's not a great fit in terms of blending these models together. It just didn't quite work out. Then there's measures, targets, initiatives. None of those exist in the business motivation model. There are things in there that kind of work. If you combine measures and targets together, then you might get an objective. But initiatives maybe is a tactic, but that's not really the intent of tactics in the business motivation model. So we knew we needed those things if you really wanted to tell the story. Otherwise, there's going to be a very unbalanced scorecard, I think. And then at the bottom, it's kind of out of scope of what we're talking about here, but those are just principles, which principles definitely exist in all kinds of enterprise architecture, but they're not part of the business motivation model because that's outside of what that model is trying to prove. So we spent a long time talking through this and trying different approaches. We tried creating perspectives as their own individual objects. We tried using those we tried making them properties of objectives, properties of goals. We tried using measures and trying to do different types of KPIs, OKR type of things. We tried to use a combination of objectives and metrics together to come up with it. Initiatives, I have to say, we didn't have to work too hard on that one. We're part of the PMO. We have a pretty strong understanding of what an initiative is. So we didn't have to really work about that too much. But after a lot of trial and error and testing, we ended up with a completely integrated model. So here we had vision and mission. They stayed the same. We decided strategic priorities mapped really well to goals. The strategic results, we just made the description of goals so that we'd have a short name for the goal and then a nice long description that says what the point of the goal is. We decided the circles with all the lines, the strategy map was indeed a strategy map. And we kind of modeled that off of an activity system map, which I suppose you could look up if not familiar, but it mapped really well to that. And so those circles turned into strategies. The perspective itself, we left as a property on strategies, but we also put that property on other things like objectives. We used an algorithm to just kind of pass it on to everything else, so that made sense. The things across the bottom, those are principles. They came from other parts of the model that we already had. Measures, we have an object called measure, and so we decided that would be a good fit. It just talks about the thing you would measure without necessarily a direction. The target, which says that we should increase something, like the example I'm pointing at here, says 5% increase in index next period, then stabilize. That is definitely a smart, measurable, time-bound thing. So that target turns into objective, and then initiatives, state initiatives. And then we decided to make the entire thing its own component type called scorecard, so we could start tying things to it. So we would say that a strategy is included in a scorecard, and an objective is included in a scorecard, which made all of the queries very easy to build these when we got to the enterprise dashboarding. So the actual model that goes behind it looks a bit more like this. It's very similar to the BMM, but it definitely takes its own route. So on the top left, we have the concept of assessments, which come from the business motivation model. Influencers and trends, all of that is part of the business motivation model's approach at figuring out what are the right strategies, the right goals, tactics, all of that. We did end up dropping tactic off of here because we decided that we had a different concept called proposed change, which lent itself better to some of the PMI type work we were doing, the program management stuff. Strategies stayed what they were, objectives, goals, stuck with the BMM definition, and then we created measures and scorecards to go along with it. Then different departments could own the scorecard or be aligned to the scorecard. We could align projects to it. So we have a complete model with all the component types, all the connection types that we needed in order to build out some of these scorecards. Not listed on here purely for visual sake and modeling. Some of these objects have logical connections between them. So for instance, like a strategy to propose change. You can say a strategy motivates a program and proposed changes belong to a program. Therefore, you can probably assume that a strategy is motivating some sort of change. And so for those, we used a script to build all those. We pulled that off of the community. But that'll just say if A is connected to B and B is connected to C, then just add a logical connection between A and C. So we do that quite a lot in order to build some of the catalogs that we'll look at. But that was a very important part that we didn't want to model specifically, but we really needed it in order to build some of the visuals. So they're entirely automated and we don't have to mess with those too much. So this is what it ends up looking like when we build it. It looks hopefully a lot like the Balanced Scorecard because that was what we were shooting for. Across the top, we have vision and mission. There you can see goals and strategic results, even though strategic results are just the description of the goals. On the left, you get your strategy map, which, like I said, is modeled after an activity system map. So you get all of these. I'll talk about that when we get to it, but we have that all built out. You'll notice there's coloring on there. So when you get to the catalog on the right, everything in that dark orange color, those organizational capacity things, you'll notice that same perspective comes along through objectives on the catalog to the right. So you can see that that objective hits those items on the bottom, and then the blue rows match to the blue items in the left, and the gold row matches the gold on the left, and the pink one to the pink on the left. We tried specifically to make it a bit more colorblind friendly, which is why it doesn't really follow corporate colors here. But since coloring was a big part of what's going on here, we did our best to not make any confusing colors. Not sure. Hopefully that worked out well. I guess we'll find out over time. So if we start digging through some of this, first we have that strategy map. So what's going on here is everything at the bottom is, we read this from bottom up, right? So organizational capacity, these are the tools, the technology, the people, the capacity, the ability to do the work. You have to do those things because those are following the lines. They're enabling the things above it. So strategically, we want project cost management. We want objective-driven prioritization, consistent frameworks. Those types of things are going to differentiate, or maybe not differentiate, but they're going to be the philosophy and the strategy for how we run an APMO. You go above that, and you get objective-driven prioritization and consistent frameworks. Doing those together will help coach best practices, right? And then best practices can build up in the financial section, integrated risk management. So you see all these things start at the bottom and work their way up. And as you'll see when we get to the catalog side, most of the project work we're going to do is going to be in the bottom two layers, because it's really hard to just do a project that improves your financial, right? If your financial goal is something like, or financial strategy is grow a certain market segment, it's really hard to just do a project that does that. Or if your goal is, or if your objective is increase revenue by 20% or something crazy, that's really hard to just do. If you could just do a project like that, everybody would do those projects. But what happens in reality is you have to do the things at the bottom, because those are enabling the workup. So you need to improve your tool sets so that you can possibly change your processes, right? So if you have old systems built in COBOL from years and years ago, they may not be able to adapt to new processes very easy. And if you can't adapt to new processes, then you probably can't map up to the things that customers want today, things like direct sales and self-service. You probably can't get to those because your processes can't support it, because your technology can't support it. And if the customers aren't happy, then you're probably not going to make your financial goals, right? So this is telling you that you need to work at the things at the bottom and move your way up. So you should be doing more work on the bottom things. But if you can find a project that directly hits one of those financial things, you should probably prioritize it up there, because that's really important. And I should say that the Balanced Scorecard does say you can flip the order of these. You can put the most important thing at the top and the least important thing at the bottom. So like nonprofits would often put customer at the top and financial towards the bottom. It's not really important for the talk here, but that's one thing you could do. So if you find something in the top row that you can directly do, you would probably prioritize that higher. As far as the catalog side of things, we decided to make this catalog based on objectives, where we left the objective not directly SMART. So it's not like the one that's highlighted there, improve project resource budget forecasting. That's not directly SMART, right? It's not directly measurable. It doesn't, at least the measure isn't implied in the name of it. The timeline isn't implied in the name of it. But instead, that's what the measures are for, right? So there might be more than one way to measure that objective, any given objective. Sometimes there'll be, maybe there's just one, maybe there's more, but we wanted to open up some opportunities. So again, you could keep that perspective idea in mind and say, well, how would you measure XYZ from a customer perspective? How would you measure success from a process perspective? And you could still use those same perspective concepts without specifically modeling that every measure has to belong to one of those. And so now we can say that for that financial objective, there are 4 different ways we measure it, right? Maybe it's percent of projects with 10%, within 10% accuracy, or I guess in the 90% accurate. 20% of our project, or some percentage of projects that are 20%, right? And so we can color code those and say, well, we are not doing great, or maybe we're not trending great with projects that are at least 90% accurate, but we're doing really good on the ones that are at least 80%, or at least 80% accurate. And maybe we're doing great because we're reducing the ones that are worse than 25%, right? So we can set up a lot of different measures that might be important. And then there's the related projects, right? So all this work came from projects. How do we make sure that those projects are tied together? And so we tied those there. So the colors on those might mean status, right? So I think in the case here, blue is complete, orange is in planning. We would use different colors on here to kind of decide where they are. Then there's an owner assigned to each one of these objectives, and then a place to put remarks. So the way this works in practice, as we start to dig through it, is we have this dashboard thrown out there, and we have a strategies team, right? So a team of our top executives who meet weekly and kind of talk through where the company is going, how are we performing, and then at regular intervals, they will update these objectives. They're not specifically doing it, but there is someone in there taking the minutes, and that person's job is to come in here afterwards or even during the meeting, and they can type in any updates to these. So they can open up the measure, they can change the status from they said it was 20, now it's 25. So however they go about doing that, they might send that out individually to all the members. They might just hear the update in the meeting. And so this makes a really easy way for them to just jump in here real quick, click on it, change the row, be done with it. So they don't have to pass around spreadsheets or anything like that. They just hear about it. That person in the meeting, that analyst, just takes care of it. So it kind of offloads it so everyone's able to see it, but they don't have to necessarily worry about updating it. And that's not an analyst on our team. That is an analyst, it's our risk analyst, who's in a completely different department, who just sits in that meeting and takes care of it for us. So that works out pretty well. The project side of things, that we have to automate. So we have, like we said earlier, Workfront as our project management tool. There's always a balance trying to find out how much we should bring over. So what does ABACUS need for really telling the story that we have here? We need to know that the project exists. We need to know the status of it. Maybe we probably want to know the cost of it, but we don't need to know every resource type. We don't need to know all the details. And so we wrote a .NET script that we run regularly, and it just goes over to Workfront through the REST API, and it just sucks in all the projects. We have some filters in there, so projects that have been complete for a certain amount of time, it filters out, and it pulls in every single project, and it puts it where it needs to go in the hierarchy. We don't delete any projects, though. That would probably mess up our modeling in other places. So any project that's been complete for a certain amount of time, we change the status of it in ABACUS, and we've got catalogs internally that we go through, and we can monitor those to make sure the projects are taken care of, that they're properly archived in ABACUS, whether that means deleted them or whatever we do. But that allows us to pull in all the projects, try our best to sort those and organize them. And then we flag those as ones that we want to appear. Like we said, that we can have things appear in here. We do that for everything on here. We do sometimes get some projects showing up in the list that we don't really want in the list, but that's not very often. So there's other good things that come about with this, right? You'll see there's one measure in there that has, or one objective has no measures. It's a great conversation starter. So at some point, this is an example, but at some point, somebody probably said, yeah, that'd be great. We should track that. That should be an objective. That really marks our success. But then in conversations throughout the year, our EA group meets up regularly with all of our different executives. And we talk through where are they going? What does success look like? What's their priorities? And then we see things like that and we say, well, it looks like here you have an objective that you can't measure. So is that really a good objective? And it's a good conversation starter. It gets us moving and having the right conversations so that we can make sure we're prioritizing projects properly. which is not necessarily us doing it, but it's us providing information to the rest of EPMO and to IT so that they can work together and prioritize the projects. Right, so I think that brings me to my final thoughts here. And I'll sit on this slide instead, it makes more sense. All of this works really well for us. We still have some of our executives that we work with that like things printed, and so a dashboard isn't always a tool for them. This, however, did work out. The strategy map on the left didn't exist when we started this, but our ask was to talk about what is our strategy and how are we aligning to it. Our EA group owns the framework and the architecture of what strategy is. We don't define any of those strategies, but we own the modeling for it, and so we work with our strategies team. And so we put that strategy map together based on information we got from our regular sync up meetings, from our corporate plan, from all the documents we could gather. And we built what we thought was correct. We sent that up to our executive vice president. He really liked it, so he took it to the full board of directors. They all reviewed it, and that became the strategy map for the organization. And so now every year, when goals and objectives change, we can bring that up at the strategies team, that big group I was talking about that meets weekly. We can bring it up there and we can review that and say, are we changing direction? Are these strategies still relevant? And then as those things change, that provides us the hooks that we need to go reactively or hopefully proactively changing some of these strategies. And then what that means throughout everything. That helps us reprioritize projects, because if one strategy is no longer important, we can go start tying that to like the rest of those logical connections. We can use our model to say, all right, well, that strategy is really motivating these projects. So now maybe these projects shouldn't be important anymore because the strategy is no longer the direction we want to go. So that helps us not just do the analysis, but prove the work that we're trying to do. So even if we don't have people viewing this every day, which we definitely don't, it's a great conversation starter, because we take parts of it and we send that out and we have conversations around those. And it leads to getting better goals and objectives. So every year the corporate plan comes out and our EA group gets to be a big part of that, big part of drafting it. Again, we don't decide what it should be, but we do get to have the framework and the architecture. We do get to essentially craft it based on the input. And so that gives us the tools we need in order to have the conversations and do all this. And I should say our EA group is only 3 people, so we're pretty small. We're located in the EPMO. We're not part of IT. We're like our own independent group, which gives us a little more leeway to be fully enterprise focused rather than just departmental focused or just IT focused, right? So once we started on this path to figure out everything we're doing, we broke the mold for what we've been doing. We don't care about just IT projects. If anyone is doing anything that's significantly changing the business, we care about it. As long as it's not a normal thing you're doing, we want to get that organized. We want to put that in the correct program. We want to tie it to a strategy or not tie it to a strategy, so we can have those conversations and say, why are we doing this over here? It's going to take a lot of effort when they could be doing this other thing, or they're doing this big effort, but no one's talking about it. We need to raise the visibility of it because that's really important. Even though it doesn't involve IT time, it's a big change for the organization. So if nothing else, this has been great because it's been a conversation starter. It runs those conversations. It gives us the tools we need to do the analysis. And it's built in a way that we're not the only ones adding information to it, right? We might be the only ones putting the strategy map together, but we're not the only ones updating those objectives and keeping the remarks and running those conversations. Kind of puts it on autopilot. So that's my talk. That's everything I have. If we want to get into some Q&A, I'd be happy to answer some questions.
Thanks so much, James. So for the first question, you may want to go back to the dashboard just in case you wanted to explain anything related to that. We did have someone who said that complimented your dashboard and said it looks very clean and well formed. They're wondering what version of ABACUS you're using to generate the Balanced Scorecard dashboard. You guys should be on ABACUS 9, but I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about maybe how you formed this dashboard, or if you have any tips for others who may be looking to create something similar.
Yeah, so we're always on the latest version. I don't think we've ever deleted any updates to it.
Okay.
So yeah, it was a lot of trial and error. So the strategy map on the left was pretty straightforward. We modeled it exactly after what was in the Balanced Scorecard literature. The objectives on the right was a bit more complicated because we really had a debate between should it be a catalog of metrics, a catalog of objectives, or a catalog of something else. And we went back and forth on that many, many times until we landed on this. And we really liked the idea. If we put measures on there, if it was a catalog of measures, then the objectives would have been duplicated a lot. And I think it would have lost some of the grouping that needs to go with it. So that, like, it's great you're measuring it, but I have to go look over somewhere else to figure out why it's an important thing to measure. So we decided objectives told you what was important to measure, and then the specific measures were just less important. You could just focus on the ones that are red or yellow. And so we spent a long time trying different variations of the objectives and initiatives. I guess I'll also add, there are other things we would probably need to add to it, but we'll probably, being able to understand how a strategy links to an objective, that would be great to know, but it's not part of that key visual. And so we have to ask ourselves, how frequently is that used or referenced? And it's probably used by EA a lot, but not by the audience we're creating. And so at some point, it'd probably be great to have a separate dashboard you can link to from here that shows a little more detail. But as it stands now, we really focused on staying true to what the Balanced Scorecard was, with the idea that it needs to be our meta model driving it, not just the meta model that the Balanced Scorecard prescribes. Right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Great. And I think it's really great how you certainly use the colors to kind of tie in the catalog with the strategy map. I think that makes everything look nice and clean as well. Some of those smaller kind of design touches I think are great and help things to be more clear and easy to focus on and see when you're looking at it. So great job with that one. We had somebody who asked if you could repeat the process and applications you use to pull data about projects and programs. I don't know if you could touch on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I thought this would be a question that came up. So we use Workfront, Adobe Workfront, as our project management tool. We've used that for several years. It has a REST API that goes with it. So in ABACUS, there's the IDE for writing scripts. We did that through, I think, C# is what we have on that one. And it's just a C# script that calls their API, pulls in all of their project data. We have some filters built into that script, but it's entirely C#. And it just pulls in there. We have it looking at projects within a certain date range. So anything that's been closed for a certain amount of time, anything that's a certain status, like if it's a rejected project or if it's some project from a year ago that was still on hold. Like there are some projects we just filter out based on status and time frame. But all of that is just hard coded in C#. As far as the process goes, we just run it regularly. It's the way we have it set up is programs are their own object, their own component type, and then projects are their own component type, and projects are the child of a program. And so when we go to Workfront, we don't actually look at the programs in Workfront. We look at all the projects, and then the projects have a field in the API that says what program they belong to. It's just like as a reference. And so then we just kind of flatten that out, go make a list and say, go to all the programs, change their names to match. It's all purely REST API driven. And so we're just really doing a pulling the data from here, from Workfront, pulling the data from ABACUS, match up everything that matches up, everything that doesn't match, add it, or change it if there's an ID that other things don't change. And so we just run that on a regular time frame. You can schedule it. We haven't scheduled it yet. I don't know why. I think we got carried away with other things. But it's a really easy thing you could just schedule to run regularly. But right now, we just, whenever we check in like once a week, we just click the button and it just pulls them in there.
Excellent, great. So we have someone else who mentioned that they missed where the path from project to proposed change to outcome appeared. They're wondering whether project dependencies are included in your scorecard logic or if that's out of your visual scope.
It is out of the visual scope. So the model that kind of works through here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but proposed change is when we're defining programs. So the EA group is usually at the very beginning, like we have regular meetings with our the business departments, and they tell us what they want to do, and then we decide that probably needs to be its own program. And so then we talk to them about that for a while, go back to the rest of the EPMO, and then make a decision if it should be a program. And if it is, then we start this whole program road mapping process that we've built out. And so the first major step of that is identifying what changes do they want to make. So without projects, without, like, I guess there's a program because proposed changes are children of a program, but you go through and say you want to change how you pay agents. You want to completely change that whole compensation system. We go through and say, all right, what do you want to do? Like, well, we want to change these types of job titles, and you want to change it so that this works differently and change that. And so we list out all the changes they want to make to the business, not system changes, but business changes. We call those proposed changes. Those are tactics in the BMM. That's how we see it. And so we identify all of those changes. And then for each change, we then go through, and this is with the business in the meeting, we say, why are you making that change? What's the outcome? Is it going to be a positive outcome, a negative outcome? And so then the proposed change achieves that, even if it's negative. So maybe you're making a new product or something, and there's an outcome that you're going to sell more of that product and probably sell less of some other product because you're going to cannibalize some sales. We document all of that, and then we put that together into a, we try to put that in order and say, all right, well, when do you want these outcomes to happen? They say, well, that outcome we need to happen earlier because that's really important to us. But these other ones, we can do those some other time. And so then we put that in a order of operations and try to say, all right, well, then you need to make, if you want these outcomes in that order, then you need to make these changes in this other order. And so a change, as you can see in here, a change might require another change, but you're not going to see those changes because they're too low level for the scorecard. And so what we do is we then take a set of changes and then group them together and say that one project makes one or more changes. And so then you can say, you can look at any project and say, this project is expected to make these changes, which will result in these outcomes. And then we put those projects in a priority order and then pass it off to a program manager. And then they build Gantt charts and things off of it in Workfront. And so hopefully that answers some of it. It's a whole process around defining the changes, defining the outcomes, and then sanity checking them to make sure we're doing things in the right order, grouping or changes together into logical projects. So we can say, well, if these changes are all required to be together, then let's just put them in the same project. If we can do a one change, one project, we prefer that. We like smaller projects that you can complete rather than have projects run on for years and years. So we try to handle that interdependency at the change level, and then we design projects to address the changes, not just do the projects that are requested.
Okay, great. Someone was wondering if you identify potential overlapping initiatives, from comparing against the Balanced Scorecard.
I don't think we've done it through the scorecard. We've definitely identified it a lot because we have those regular sync up meetings. We use this whole process in the scorecard, all of that to run those meetings. And so we do find out about one of the most common things we run into is people want training, and so they go buy some sort of training system, or they buy some training that comes with its own learning management system. And I'm pretty sure every department has done that at some point. And so when we're meeting with them, we say, hey, there's already a project over here. Maybe you can tackle it together and then have one learning management system. And so we do find some of that. But I can't say that the scorecard itself has been what does it, but the conversations that come about because of it probably have helped quite a bit.
Sure, that makes sense. And then if something like a program or an initiative is yellow or red, how are recommendations or corrective actions generated for that? How often do you review it with the board to correct a strategy?
So we don't get to talk to the board very often, but we do talk to some of the board members, some of the what we call the resident board, right? The people who work here who are on the board. So we do have pretty regular meetings with them, but normally we're not bringing those things up. That would come up in the strategies team meetings where they would look at that and they would see a bunch of yellow or red and they'd say, whoa, why is that yellow or red? And then those executives would talk about it in their own. So it's not really the board that's having to deal with it. It's that strategies team who is probably our main audience, is that group. So then they can explain why it's some direction or not, or they can try to take care of it from there.
Okay, great.
But we're not usually involved in that conversation. It's kind of on autopilot.
Makes sense. Now, do you have technical aspects or relationships that can be drilled down from the strategies or objectives?
Yeah, not on the visual. That really comes into play when I was talking about earlier that the model has to be set up to support telling those visual stories.
Sure.
You can definitely, our model, if you trace it, can get you all the way from, let's see, where's my big picture here? So there's a more detailed version of this picture, but it's possible to go from the bottom left corner of this all the way up to the specific data entities or to the specific applications that are running. But you sometimes have to go through 10 jumps or so, right between, we have this strategy, which is motivating a program, which is going to result in a change, and that change is going to be changing a capability, which is run by an application, or which is impacted by some application, and that application is hosted on a server, and therefore that server is being changed by a strategy. It is absolutely possible, but big but here, a lot of it is a many-to-one or many-to-many relationship. So the farther you jump between there, the more context you lose in terms of, well, that strategy is making 10 different changes, or it's motivating 10 different changes, and those 10 changes result in 30 different capabilities being touched. And so you start to lose some fidelity as you make those jumps through. So we do try to use those logical connections as much as we can to simplify some of that and automate it, but it is definitely possible, but we don't have it set up today that it's easy. It's definitely, we tried to do a tree map. Those are a real big one. We wanted a tree map diagram that you could click on one and just keep drilling through, but that's still a work in progress to try to figure out exactly which connections to follow there. But hopefully version 2 will have something like that.
Great. Yeah, always good to keep on progressing. So that's great. We do actually have a couple questions about your model. We have a question regarding, having such a large meta model that consists of a number of frameworks. Do you find it difficult to maintain? And also wondering if your team has knowledge in all of the frameworks that you're using. Yeah,
so like I said, we're located in the EPMO. We've got 3 architects, right? We have a data architect, a business architect, and a technology architect. I'm the technology architect. I came from IT. I spent my entire career in IT up until a few years ago when they moved me out of IT and they set up a whole EA department, and I'm on EA now. So I understand our technology and the TOGAF stuff backwards and forwards. So the bottom right stuff in green over here, I am very well versed in. For our organization, I helped design a lot of it. So that's easy. We have a data architect who knows intimately the data architecture side of things. And then our business architect is very much into BizBoc and understand all the stuff that's in blue. So everything that's in green, I understand really well. Stuff that's in blue, our business architect, and the stuff that's in yellow is our data architect. Everything else we consider to be shared amongst the team. So the business motivation model in the bottom left, because we're not specifically technology focused in our EA practice, I would say, if anything, we're strategy focused in our EA. At least that's been our focus for the last 3 years or so. So we understand that really well. Our business architect was a project manager in a previous life for a very long time. So she understands the PMI and all of that very, very well, as well as the Business Architecture Guild stuff. Before I came here, I was deep into ITIL, so I understand ITIL very well. I understand the areas that we're not as strong at, some of the process modeling, business rules. But to be fair, our organization isn't great at business rule management right now. So not understanding that, I would say in that business rule, that purplish one at the top right, there's that part of the model is almost completely barren. Like, we know that it's there, but there's plenty of ways to get connections. We know that it's going to exist at some point, but right now we don't focus on it. The business model canvas, we try to use that as a tool for running workshops. And so we don't put a lot of effort into maintaining it, though that is the thing that we wish we were doing primarily. So we all have the 3 people on the team is pretty small, but we have a pretty mixed background. So we understand all this pretty well. The the Enterprise Business Motivation Model by Nick Malik. You can go to the website, it's at the bottom here, motivationmodel.com, and do all about it. He has a ton of research. Like, he's dedicated his entire career to building this thing. And so we rely on his documentation a lot to understand the parts we don't understand. And when we don't understand something, we spend a lot of time talking through it. So we're not overly focused on any one area. So it's not like we have a really deep technology part. And I didn't include the more detailed version of this. If you go to the website down there, you'll see what it looks like. It looks very much similar. But our entire model is based on doing analysis work, not being the source of truth for all of the stuff. So it's okay that as long as we have enough of the information, we have a pretty good understanding of all of it.
Okay, maybe we may have time for one more quick question, and it's kind of related to what you just talked about. So wondering about your choice to use Nick Malik's business motivation model versus the object management group's business motivation model. Do you have any thoughts on why you chose one over the other?
Yep, so the enterprise business motivation model, it includes it. Like, it's based on it, right? If you go and look at the source material from it, and all the research that he did putting into it, it is based on that. So you'll see a lot of the things we have goals, objectives, strategies. They're all the same terminology with the same definitions. If you read the object management group's specification file with it, he uses the exact same definitions in his. So the problem is the business motivation model by object management group is just that bottom left section. Right? It doesn't account for anything else. It doesn't care about technology. It doesn't care about data. It doesn't care about business processes. It doesn't care about any of that. And so we have to go with a more broad model so that we can tie the motivation into the things that it's actually motivating, right? What are we changing? Business motivation, or the object management group, doesn't care about capabilities. So we needed something that's more robust, that we can actually say, what are we motivating? Like, sure, these are the goals and objectives, but why? What does that mean to us? And so we needed something a bit more robust. And this one, it's much more focused. It doesn't focus heavily in any one area. It tries to tell the holistic story of all of it. So we built this